Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Fellow and Director of the Europe program here at CSIS. And I have to say, every once in a while, we do an event that is incredibly timely and topical and relevant, and I cannot think of a more important discussion than we are going to have this morning. We are very pleased to be able to be a launch point for the release of the Trilateral Commission.
Ona chce tam wskakiwać.
Ciszeczko.
Has cited foreign dangers. Foreign dangers, in fact, to justify a consolidation of power at home. There have been a variety of issues. We've seen clearly in the case with Ukraine, in terms of his ratings last year and his ratings now, they've gone up from some 63% previously now to some 80%. Basically here, in terms of foreign policy, there's also the issue of the creation of a geopolitical and geoeconomic demand, if you will, for Russia. And here the creation of a kind of sphere, a sphere of states that are united in terms of their values, and it's a post-Soviet sphere. And this is where Ukraine certainly comes into play and is a very important factor in that. Let me mention the fourth point is the issue of energy. We had a very robust discussion about energy, and with the events of a recent time, the annexation, the unlawful annexation of Crimea and the aggression in Ukraine, this has become a more critical issue. And has been very extensively under discussion. I would say that this issue does matter.
Front door. Alfie, can I open the front door?
Yeah. Da, da, da.
I didn't see one.
No.
Oh, Ryan, get him! Hurry, hurry, hurry! Oh. Oh my God!
Oh no, sticky. Waffle? You just fell in the toilet.
What are you videotaping?
Sure, because the cat almost took a bath a second ago.
The cat is fast.
that, and he ran to Putin, and Putin says, okay, I'll buy Ukrainian bonds $50 billion worth, and immediately bought $3 billion, et cetera, et cetera. Lavrov went back to Ashton, European Union commissars, asking to make it trilateral. Let's talk, he said, about Ukrainian situation, because they are in such dire straits, in such difficult economic situation, that without us, European Union and Ukrainians, without such triangles, we will not be able to solve Ukrainian problems. The answer was no, we will not discuss it with the third parties. And then again, I asked informally one of the colleagues in Brussels, and he says, unfortunately, even those who sympathize with the opposition cannot do format of our associate membership agreements, and third parties, especially Russia, out of bounds. So, does that mean the West is far-sighted in this situation? No blames, no things to think about in the future? I think it's not true. We have to think about trilateral, quadruple, or whatever cooperation on Ukraine, because even if we solve the problem now, let's think that we have a magic button and we strike it, and tomorrow there is peace in terms of security and political settlement. The most difficult part begins because the Ukrainians have no budget. They owe to the outside world more than 40 billion. They have no capital to start growing. They have a lot of difficulties to rebuild its institutions. And with all my sympathy to those young people who decided that they would be a kamikaze, as they themselves said, running this parliament, running this government, they have to have some money, which can only come from European Union, United States, and Russia. Russia through gas and other subsidies, European Union institution building plus money. United States has to contribute something apart from $1 billion worth of guarantees. Listen, it's...
Говорит, я шпион, хочу сдаться. Ему говорят, а вы чей шпион? Говорит, американский. Ну, тогда в 5-ю комнату. Он пошел в 5-ю комнату. Я американский шпион, хочу сдаться. А у вас оружие есть? Есть. В 7-ю, пожалуйста. Он в 7-ю. Я шпион, хочу сдаться, у меня есть оружие. В 10-ю. В 10-ю. Я шпион, хочу сдаться, у меня есть оружие. А средства связи есть? Есть. В 20-ю комнату пришел. Я шпион, у меня есть оружие, средства связи, хочу сдаться. Его спрашивают, а задание-то у вас есть? Есть. Ну идите и исполняйте, не мешайте людям работать.
Of our overall calculation. Energy does provide nearly 20% of Russia's GDP and also over half of its federal government revenue. We also know the dependency of Europe and the interrelationships here. So this is definitely an area that has to be part of this discourse. I will say in conclusion, and keeping it brief with brief comments and conversational comments right up front, in conclusion, I'd say the underpinning for the North America group is that what is going on and what happens in Ukraine and
Russian President Vladimir Putin has challenged the U.S. to present to the UN evidence that Syria attacked rebels with chemical weapons near Damascus. Mr. Putin said it would...
Чё? Давай.
Да?
Тим,
Давай, Тимон.
сейчас он обсохнет и вылезет.
Тима, давай.
Тим, дай тебе помогу. Настя, видела эти лапы?
Тима, тебе помочь? Давай. Блин, ну чё, устал?
Смотри, он вообще смотрит, говорит, вы козлы, говорит, меня предали. Какие вы у меня, говорит, братаны, нахуй.
Бедный.
Бля, надо пацану помочь.
Мне кажется, ему плохо.
Че я тебе говорю?
Тимочка, киса, ты посмотри на него, что с ним? Тима, боже. Киса.
Настя, знаешь, что ты записываешь? Зачем? Настя. Настя, а что ты мне... Настя.
Артем, что с котом?
А что с ним?
Артем,
А что с ним?
Артем, посмотри, он не реагирует, он злой.
Я пойду отсюда.
I think it is quite impossible. But I wanted to mention three issues, 3 points that emerge as the areas of consensus in Europe and as the areas for necessitating action. The first is give Ukraine a chance to sort out from the collapse of the governance and of its economy. And giving that chance means to insulate Ukraine to the extent possible from external pressure and external blackmail, and also helping Ukraine in genuine efforts to improve its economic situation. The beginning for those efforts will come with the beginning of the IMF program, which will succeed only if it is supported generously and patiently by the West, but also by Russia. If Russia decides to sabotage this program, Ukraine will have very hard time to implement it. My second point is that nowadays contagion spreads wide and very fast, as we know, not only in finance, in politics as well. If not contained, the illegal annexation of Crimea will have grave consequences for the EU. Firstly, international law is of key importance for the EU. The EU only exists because there is an assumption that international treaties will be respected in all circumstances. EU has no other means of governing than through the law. No other force can be used. So if illegal annexation of Crimea was accepted or tolerated, that would undermine the rule of law in Europe and would result in more Ukraines in the future. But also, secondly, there are many places in Europe where people say, why should I be minority in your country if you can be minority in mine? There's plenty of places like that. So if one tolerates actions like Crimea, one, of course, encourages nationalistic elements in nationalistic parties, right-wing parties around Europe, East and West. And we see it already. Hungarian Jobbik made some statements about that they do support Crimea and they want to claim some Hungarian territories. And in many countries, acceptance of illegal annexation of Crimea would encourage that kind of that kind of ideas and that kind of aspirations. Now, my third point is that sanctions are necessary, but sanctions are not substitute for a strategy. Europe has to deal with a new reality, which is that Russia is not cooperative, that Russia presents itself as a rival who wants to actively work against European values and European interests. And that has to be, that situation has to be adjusted too. The EU certainly should draw red lines for future Russian actions. Certainly, EU should increase its defense capacity. Certainly, EU should enhance its independence from Russia in energy and trade. Certainly, also, EU should make sure that Russia doesn't draw benefits from European integration using European institutions and so on, which were created, which we are all benefiting from. However, European Union and Russia are in many ways complementary, and they both need each other. So long term, this is unsustainable. Long term, we should be accepting the idea that that continent will remain permanently divided. This is too a depressing perspective to resign to. So we need, and that has been mentioned by Igor and others, certainly strengthen public diplomacy, build bridges to ordinary Russians and civic society and the next generation of policymakers. But we also need to do something that we failed to do in the past. That is to design a place for Russia in European architecture that would be satisfying for Russians and useful for Europe. That has been a big failure, as I said, in the past, that we were unable to do that. To arrive to that, though, we have to
utter nonsense for Syria's government to provoke opponents with such attacks. U.S. President Barack Obama says he is considering military action against Syria after
find common voice on Russia, common view on Russia, which we don't have yet because we are slow food, slow decision making, and very varied continent. But as long as we don't have, for as long as we don't have such a concept, we are unable to offer a serious strategic debate to Russia, and Russia is, as we see, unable to think of itself differently than as a separate power without allies and without long-term commitments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shino.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to join myself with the previous speakers in thanking the CSIS for this meeting and also express my feelings of a great honor being with Dr. Brzezinski. I am in a little bit of a complicated situation because I'm supposed to be sharing with you some of the ideas of the Asian Pacific Group, which is so diverse and there's no one unified voice coming out of the whole process yet, and I don't think it will be anytime soon. But there was a certain amount of coordination between Japanese, Korean, some of the Southeast Asian members of the group, so that can be represented a little bit in the whole process. And then, of course, at some point, perhaps I need to share with you where Japan stands, being from Japan, and I may have to say a few things totally from a personal point of view. Having said that, most striking factor that I would like to stress when we talk about the Asian Pacific angle is that, as you see it on the map, Asia is a vast region, has so many different countries, and therefore each of these countries have had very different relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union, whenever you take in terms of history. So they have totally different perspectives, even now, with respect to what's happening in Russia, what is happening in Ukraine. But I think we can say at the outset that there is one point which we in Asia are concerned about, and what has to do with the points already raised, and that is the fact that the recent events do the Asian continent. We are very much concerned about what's happening in Ukraine. And that would be my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Brzezinski.
Thank you very much for having me here. Let me start by simply saying that I view what is happening today in the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and in the larger perspective between the West and the East, and specifically the United States and Russia, as a very serious development, which poses the risk that we will be. Somebody obviously wants to listen to a concert. I fear that we are in effect stumbling into a serious crisis which is somewhat unpredictable, but one which does involve, at least on the part of one side, the explicit use of force. Explicit use of force. I have no way of knowing how the Russian leadership was assessing its actions regarding Crimea and what its risk analysis was. But it's quite clear from the manner in which it was undertaken that the action contemplated the possibility of some explosion, some use of force, and therefore retained for itself the option of deniability. The Russian military, the Spetsnaz that went in, were camouflaged in a variety of dramatic ways. But it was the Ukrainians who refrained from shooting.
And Grand Rapids celebrating their new title as Beer City, USA in a very appropriate fashion later today. I'm Nicole DiDonato, live in Easttown, and those details coming up. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. That's a way to start a Thursday, Nicole.
Grand Rapids beat out places like St. Louis, Chicago, even Milwaukee. So yeah, that's the latest we have here in Easttown. Nicole DiDonato, Fox 17 News.
Oh my God.
Oh my God! And in effect surrendered, that made this action peaceful and successful at the same time. That's a good combination, but it's also a dangerous combination. Peaceful, fine, but if successful, then it's tempting. And therefore there is the risk that what we may see subsequently in the foreseeable near future is the expansion of such tactics involving a more direct collision between Russia and Ukraine, and externally between Russia and the United States. That is obviously to be avoided. But one also has to look at its deeper sources. And while Western policy has not been faultless, and some of the preceding speakers have alluded to that, including our colleague from Russia, the fact is that there has been a significant change in Russia in the last several years, away from a democratic evolution, which was underway, and which, when Medvedev was president, seemed hopeful and possible, but which has been retracted gradually, step by step, but increasingly clearly in recent times, involving not only a turn away from democracy as a near-term prospect for Russia, but for increasing emphasis on a kind of chauvinistic nationalism, which was well expressed in the speeches by Mr. Putin in the middle of March as the operation in Crimea was being consummated. It was a remarkable statement in which Russia assumed the right to use physical force to protect any Russians living outside of Russia. And of course, that does not apply to the risk that some Russians living in Paraguay may be faced by Russian military intervention. But it does apply very directly to some countries that neighbor on Russia and recovered its independence from Russia relatively recently, though peacefully. And that is a serious problem. It also is a problem which is strangely one-sided, because Russia currently
Russia is heavily dependent. When you look eastward for Russia, it doesn't have the same kind of structural capacity that it does westward. And so any changes in terms of Europe and any kind of cutting off certainly will very much directly impact Russia's economy. And secondly, there has been creative thinking in Europe. Slovakia came forward recently with this reverse flow proposal to get gas into Ukraine, which is a creative proposal. It will help Ukraine in just a short term, only for a few months, but everything matters. So bottom line is it's a political decision. There has to be political will. I think that regardless of the situation on the ground, it's in Europe's interest to become more energy diversified. I'll just stop there for the moment.
On NATO extension, is it a danger or a pretext for repositioning, if I understand your question? In a way, for the security community, military community, it is a danger. And the story in Russia, history already, which is enshrined into the textbooks, is that Mr. Gorbachev was promised when he managed to help with the reunification of Germany, he was promised that not a single soldier or military installation of NATO would be further than the dividing line of Berlin. Now, NATO commanders tell us that there is no such signed document. I once asked Mr. Gorbachev to tell me personally whether it's true or not. And he said, yes, it's true, but how can I sign anything with the living Honecker, with all of my comrades in the socialist bloc still alive and still at the top of their governments? I had an oral confirmation and reiteration of this confirmation by Kohl and American leadership that, yes, if I'm instrumental in reunification, which was contrary to Mr. Thatcher and Mr. Mitterrand's wishes, then there will be no NATO advancement. I was present at the conversation with Mr. Solana, who was the General Secretary of NATO at that time in 1993 in Moscow, who confirmed that. Yes, it was oral, but how can I base myself on oral when people want NATO, first of all, NATO enlargement, second, NATO installations advancement. But having said all of this, it's true, we feel a little bit misguided by the behavior of our colleagues in the West from this point of view. But in 2008 and 2000, (2011, 2007, 2011), when I worked for President Medvedev, I thought, and we made it as a think tankers, we made it absolutely clear to him that it's at that particular moment it was more of a pretext than a danger, showing exactly what you tell us, the behavior of some of the neophytes of NATO, like Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland. Less so Estonia, because the upbeat and very proud president of Estonia, Mr. Ilves, always poked the bear into the eye, including two, I think, fighters who are F-17, which are positioned someplace in the Baltic Sea, and all of that stuff. But for the rest of it, we were telling the president, trying to convince him to come to Lisbon summit in 2000. NATO summit, that it's more of a pretext than a real danger. And he bought the arguments. He went to Lisbon in spite of a very serious pressure on him not to go. And I was very pleased to be part of Mrs. Albright's team on strategic rethinking of NATO concept. I was invited as a visiting expert, sort of, to this thing, and we discussed many interesting issues. And in NATO, in Lisbon in 2010, Mr. Medvedev made a very good deal with NATO, which excluded Russia out of the threats, which included into the potential partners, and he brought this element back to Russia. Everything went sour after Libya. That I can tell you. After Libyan crisis, when instead of the open skies, NATO started operation, it was not NATO, but two countries supported by the United States from behind. But then all of our efforts, when we persuaded Medvedev to pass this resolution by abstaining, he faced a criticism which you wouldn't believe, saying that now we know how you are duped by NATO, Mr. Medvedev. I wouldn't say that it was the reason why Putin staged his comeback, but that was one of the elements of that. So I leave it at that.
Yes, sir.
On NATO importance, it is a highly charged situation and conflict with a lot of emotions. And people would behave much more emotionally and less responsibly if we were not in NATO. So in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, emotions would be much, much higher. We now understand what was meant by Chancellor Kohl when he said that knowing that Germany is in NATO helps him to sleep better. So this is the situation. On religion, I don't think so, sir. There is a distinctly different cultural heritage in these two parts of Ukraine. Religion is certainly one of its elements, but it is not a distinction, there is no more a distinction between Catholic and Protestant world. Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, are in European Union. Serbia is joining European Union. These are very important Orthodox countries, and it's not the Orthodox versus Catholics. On transactional and other, of course, if you implement policies and actions that you believe are imperative because of your history, because of your responsibility to the history, numbers don't matter. But once you stopped and think about it and others come to you and talk to you, numbers do matter nowadays. We were talking today that numbers matter even much more today than in 1945 or at the beginning of the Cold War. So it is trade relations. It is about trade relations, about sanctions, about restraint of private sector that happens regardless of official sanctions. This is the situation that we're seeing today with Russia. We can read in Financial Times almost daily about the company's decisions to
Ты посуду моешь, не пойму. Братан. Он, наверное, смотрел, как мы моем посуду, да? Пакет.
rather than some willful deception. In any case, it is kind of interesting that on an issue of such enormous strategic importance, this Russian side, the Soviet side, did not insist on a written commitment, if that was really so central to it. And I think the reason is that events were assuming a dynamic of their own, and it was clear that the process of change would not stop, whatever is said. So I think it's one of those retroactive arguments which really don't tell us very much. But in any case, it tells us something negative. There was no deliberate deception. And the flight into the NATO agreement from the Warsaw Pact developed subsequently in the course of several years. There's a larger question. Let's assume that there was an agreement, and Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria were not in NATO right now. Would the Ukrainian problem be easier to address, or would it be the beginning, really, of an all-European war? I think it's quite clear. You know, in international politics, as in neighborhoods, strong fences make for better neighbors. It's better to have some barbed wire supporting and dividing some countries. It's just common sense. So I don't think, again, that's a very relevant argument. The fact of the matter is that historically, particularly the Baltic countries, also Poland, to some extent Romania, have had experience with Russia, which was not all that delightful for them. And they have rather unfavorable memories of it. And it's only natural for them to be part of a larger European entity with which they can identify. But to the extent that I can gauge, I don't have a sense they view it as an exclusive proposition. This is what they really would like in the longer run, Ukraine and Russia to be part of it. But Russia to be part of it has to be a genuine democracy. And that, incidentally, wasn't mentioned in the earlier discussion. And Russia in recent years, sadly, and in my judgment, because I'm an optimist, only temporarily, is moving towards a kind of nationalistic dictatorship, which makes it altogether clear why it wouldn't have been in the interest of the Central European countries not to be today in NATO.
Well, all I can say is what a privilege it has been for the last hour and a half to listen to these insights, wrestling with today's most challenging crises. We look forward to the report. Paula, we're holding you to it, early May. But again, please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Fellow and Director of the Europe program here at CSIS. And I have to say, every once in a while, we do an event that is incredibly timely and topical and relevant, and I cannot think of a more important discussion than we are going to have this morning. We are very pleased to be able to be a launch point for the release of the Trilateral Commission.
Ona chce tam wskakiwać.
3% previously, now to some 80%. Basically here, in terms of foreign policy, there's also the issue of the creation of a geopolitical and geoeconomic demand, if you will, for Russia. And here the creation of a kind of sphere, a sphere of states that are united in terms of their values, and it's a post-Soviet sphere. And this is where Ukraine certainly comes into play and is a very important factor in that. Let me mention the fourth point is the issue of energy. We had a very robust discussion about energy, and with the events of a recent time, the annexation, the unlawful annexation of Crimea and the aggression in Ukraine, this has become a more critical issue and has been very extensively under discussion. I would say that this issue does matter.
Alfie, can I open the front door?
Yeah. Da-da-da.
I didn't see one.
No.
Oh, Ryan, get him! Hurry, hurry, hurry! Oh.
Has cited foreign dangers. Foreign dangers, in fact, to justify a consolidation of power at home. There have been a variety of issues. We've seen clearly in the case with Ukraine, in terms of his ratings last year and his ratings now, they've gone up from some 60.
Oh my God.
Oh no, Steve. Waffle? You just fell in the toilet!
What are you videotaping?
Sure, because the cat almost took a bath a second ago.
The cat is fast.
That, and he ran to Putin, and Putin says, okay, I'll buy Ukrainian bonds, $50 billion